The following is an Operation Podcast production.
There's been this torrent of new studies showing that, in general, we're just too negatively biased in how we believe other people are going to perceive us. And one of the best examples of this is a phenomenon called the liking gap. It's when you first have a conversation with someone. You can have a great conversation. You can find the other person like really charming, interesting, smart, funny. You really like them, but you go away from the conversation and you assume they didn't feel the same way about you. If you look to evolution, we know how important social connection is. Like, why have we evolved to have this barrier that is essentially making us feel more distant from the people around us than we need to? I think fundamentally what's wrong is that we're anchored in any negative experiences, even though they're very rare. It can be so hurtful when we do find that someone didn't like us as much as we thought they did, that we become overly cautious, overly pessimistic. There's just more potential for us to experience the liking gap. And we don't have enough time with all of these people to overcome those biases and to really realize how they actually feel about us.
Do you think our current ability to pay attention or to get sucked into these sins of inattention, as you describe, are these really more innate skills that can then be further developed and honed in? Or are we just getting worse as we kind of progress through society and advancements in technology, and we're just bombarded for our attention way more than we ever were in terms of news, social media, the internet, notifications? Is this something really that humans can kind of go back to and get better at, or is it just a matter of evolving with the times?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think they are innate skills that we can all develop. And it doesn't really matter what your personality is, what your upbringing was. We can all learn to the art of conversation and to show attention better. So I don't think we have to be pessimistic about this, but I do think our culture maybe has made it a bit harder for us to show our attention to another person because there are just potentially so many more distractions around us. Like in the past, people would have had a few distractions in the room with them, but they certainly didn't have like telephones vibrating in their pockets all the time with new messages. They didn't have flashing screens on the walls that might be announcing the news 24 hours a day. So it is harder, I think, to pay attention in certain environments than it would have been in the past. But we can learn to filter out those distractions, like the human capacity to build our concentration and our focus and our willpower is much more than we recognize often. I think really we also just have to do that, we have to first of all recognize the importance of this. And so that's what I'm trying to do with this chapter really, is just to tell people that it's not really a minor kind of these are genuine sins in that they are breaking what I call the shared reality between you and another person. Like it's not just kind of bad manners that can be overlooked. Like you're really destroying the sense of mutual understanding between you and the other person when you do allow yourself to be distracted. So you have to prioritize that. If you want your relationships to get better, you really have to put your attention on the other person and show your interest.
In my experience, being able to fully pay attention and to give another person or a room of people my undivided attention, there's certain things we can do once we're in that moment, right? And I would love to kind of get there in a moment with you in terms of turning off notifications. How do we really lock into the person? How do we really, drop in, be more present? But in my experience, a lot of that has to do with the level to which, before I ever walk into that room, I can leave maybe the day's worries or the thoughts or whatever stressors or whatever was on my mind behind. Because I think a lot of people struggling to pay attention, or on the other side, feeling like this person really isn't paying that much attention to me, can be because of a lot of other things going on in their mind. Maybe they had a bad day at work. Maybe somebody cut them off on the way there. Maybe they're freaking out about a financial situation. But, how do we really kind of walk into the room and leave all that behind us to really be as present as possible?
I mean, it's really tough. And so I don't think we should beat ourselves up too much if we do have these external stresses that have frayed our attention, left us feeling a little bit more distracted. Like it can be really horrible walking into a party when you've just like had a terrible meeting at work or a big disappointment. And so, one of the things that I think we can remember is just that the act of connecting with other people will put those other stresses in perspective. So, it is worth the effort to try to overcome that and to see this as a useful distraction away from those other stresses. So, it's, in motivational science, it's just we know the importance of recognizing the value of what we're doing. So, I think a bit of self awareness there can be really useful. But actually, people are very empathetic and understanding as well. So rather than trying to hide the fact that you've had this terrible day from the other people, you might be better just to actually tell them and just apologize. Say, I'm sorry, I'm not totally with you right now because I've just had this bad news, or, I'm really worried about my financial situation. Can you just bear with me? I think it's much better for them to have that explanation so that they can understand your behavior and where you're coming from, rather than giving them the potential to misinterpret what you're doing, how you're behaving. Because if they don't know that background, they could think that you genuinely just don't care about them. Our capacity to misinterpret other people is kind of infinite. So it's definitely better to just be upfront, and that's something that comes through the whole of the book. Actually, is that often just being a bit open with other people pays off. People respect and admire us when we do tell them, what's really going on underneath our skin. We don't have to always try to put on an act for other people.
I couldn't agree more, but I don't think everyone can get there as much as maybe as they would like. For me, when I think about that, excuse me, it comes down to a level of openness, level of honesty, level of vulnerability, to be as just, hey, here's really what's going on with me, so that we can really drop in together. And that kind of takes some time to develop. No, not everybody is going to be as open, honest, and vulnerable when they could just go right into small talk, or go, yeah, I can sit here and appease this person in conversation and still mull over what's going on in my mind. So how do we get there?
Yeah, I mean, it's something I've wrestled with myself. It's just very difficult to acknowledge a vulnerability to another person, because we're naturally suspicious that the other person might view that as a sign of weakness, that they might, use it to our disadvantage in some way. If you're talking to a stranger, not someone that you know and trust, we tend to be quite suspicious and quite just quite concerned about our reputation. So we do try to create this polished, perfect veneer. But the research shows us that when we do offer our vulnerabilities to other people, they do respond better than we expect. They see it as a sign of courage. They appreciate the honesty. So we can certainly afford to do that a bit more. But I think fundamentally we do have to, we can do two things to make that easier. The first is to practice a bit more self-compassion towards ourselves. So in our culture, we've created this kind of idea where it's valued to be self-critical. Often we think that holding ourselves to super high standards, beating ourselves up over our mistakes, is the way to move forward and to create progress. We assume that it's just part of the learning experience is to be really hard on ourselves. But the research shows that's not true at all. And in fact, being self-compassionate, treating our mistakes with kindness, is actually not just better for our mental well-being. We're actually more likely to learn from our mistakes if we are kind and gentle to ourselves and treat ourselves more as we would hope a friend might treat us, with honest advice, but still with some level of compassion and forgiveness. So that's something that I think we need to practice. And when you have self-compassion, when that becomes automatic and habitual, I think it helps us to realize that other people are just not going to be judging us as harshly as we think they are either. And there's, good research to back that up, as I've said. And also when you look at the typical social faux pas that people can make, things like that we might find really embarrassing, like turning up to a friend's dinner party without a bottle of wine. Like with all that kind of those situations, like saying the wrong answer at a quiz, any situation you can name really, where we would imagine that we're going to be judged quite harshly. We overestimate how negatively someone is going to judge us by twofold. We're about people in general are about half as judgmental as we assume they're going to be. So we can be forgiving to ourselves, and I think knowing knowing those facts, knowing that research actually just helps us to be a lot more self-compassionate. And once we are self-compassionate, then we just naturally find it a little easier to reveal those vulnerabilities.
Yeah, you've mentioned research quite a bit. I mean, and the subtitle of your book is even The Scientific Secrets of Building a Strong Social Network. Can you share with us what are some of these scientific experiences, these evidence shown through research of really how humans operate better through vulnerability, better through learning how to pay closer attention?
Yeah, so I mean, so I'm a science writer. I've got a scientific background. For the last like 18 years, I've been like covering the latest like cutting edge research. So to me, science is the best lens to view pretty much anything through. It's just I feel like I mean I still really appreciate culture, and that's why I look into the philosophy of friendship in my book, and look to novels and films for inspiration as well. But fundamentally, when I'm writing and for putting for giving myself kind of guidance, I want to know that there's good evidence behind it that's been thoroughly tested. And so, there's just a lot of this recent research in social psychology. What really inspired me to write the book was the fact that there's been this torrent of new studies showing that, in general, we're too negatively biased in how we believe other people are going to perceive us. And one of the best examples of this is a phenomenon called the liking gap, which is when you first have a conversation with someone, like we're doing now, like here in this recording. You can have a great conversation. You can find the other person like really charming, interesting, smart, funny. You really like them, but you go away from the conversation and you assume they didn't feel the same way about you. Like on average, everyone does this, that we think that,
Yep.
yeah, exactly. It's like, it's such a common experience. And what I love is that you find even people who you would not imagine would feel like this, they have those doubts. They think they like the other person more than the other person liked them. It's just, happening across the population.
Why is that?
Yeah, it's kind of bizarre because you'd think like, if you look to evolution, we know how important social connection is. Like, why have we evolved to have this barrier that is essentially making us feel more distant from the people around us than we need to? And I think it could partly be cultural, like it could be that we learn from a young age that we have to be sensitive to other people, and it pays to be cautious to a certain extent, to not take other people for granted. When we're about 5 or 6, we realize that people can start to mask their feelings, and so that kind of naturally generates these doubts. Well, like
And
just because
hurt
this,
ours
right, exactly,
time,
yeah, exactly, because we suddenly realize, well, just because they seemed interested in me doesn't mean they actually were. So it pays to be a bit cautious because you don't want to be caught out with that. But I think fundamentally what's wrong is that we're anchored in any negative experiences, even though they're very rare. It can be so hurtful when we do find that someone didn't like us as much as we thought they did, that we become overly cautious, overly pessimistic. And perhaps in modern society, when we're meeting so many new people, which wasn't necessarily so common previously. If you grow up in the same village, most people are familiar to you. Now you live in a city, you're meeting strangers all the time. For our jobs, we're meeting loads of new colleagues who we might not interact with very regularly. So there's just more potential for us to experience the liking gap. And we don't have enough time with all of these people to overcome those biases and to really realize how they actually feel about us.
Is this kind of like that example in the book, the porcupine study, about how the porcupines in like cold weather, they begin to kind of all huddle together, but then they prick each other and they kind of just go through this cycle until they really fill out this harmonious distance and balance?
Yeah, exactly. So that was
Can you walk
Schopenhauer.
us through this example a little bit more?
Yeah, so that was from the philosopher Schopenhauer, who I mean, he was not an easy person to get on with either. But like a lot
Maybe a
of
human porcupine.
right, exactly. So you can see why he might have he had like a very cantankerous personality, but still managed to make a lot of friends, which I find like super optimistic actually. Because if you look at people like him and Isaac Newton, they still like had really great social lives, even though they were pretty difficult people. But yeah, he came up with this kind of parable called the porcupine's dilemma, where he, as you described, he was saying how porcupines want to huddle together for warmth, but then they start to prick each other, so they have to create this distance between each other. So it's never really optimum for them. They'd much rather be closer together, but then they have the pain of the pricks. And he said, human beings are the same. And he claimed that we created our kind of social norms of manners to kind of create that safe distance. I think, that gap between the porcupines, the liking gap is essentially one example of that in human society. And then what is so optimistic and empowering about this research is that it shows it's kind of an unnecessary barrier, that actually we could get closer together without being hurt. We just have to have more confidence in our own social abilities, more confidence in other people's social abilities, in their motives, in their intentions, to recognize that actually people are more trustworthy, kinder, more empathetic than we realize. And the good thing is, once we push ourselves out of our comfort zone, when we practice our social skills more, when we are a little bit braver to talk to strangers or to be the first person to, after a conversation, to suggest meeting up again, when we do that, we can readjust, recalibrate those biases. We can close the liking gap because, just for experiment, essentially, we find out that actually, other people are much nicer than we think, and they like us more than we think. And it only takes, the research suggests, just 1 week really for people to change those expectations and to start to be a lot more optimistic about their potential to connect.
1 week of what? 1 week of continuous connections and engagement? What do you mean by 1 week?
Yeah, exactly. So I'm thinking of one study in particular where these participants were just asked, go out, talk to strangers. They were given a kind of scavenger hunt where they were told, like find someone with like crazy hair. I mean, like crazy good hair to talk to. Or someone with like a cute dog in the park and just make conversation about their pet. Or someone who's like doing some kind of creative pursuit, ask them what they're doing, get them to talk about their project. So the participants just went out, they did this kind of scavenger hunt every day for a week, and then the scientists studied how their attitudes to other people had changed from the beginning of the week to the end of the week, and they found at the start of the week, these people were experiencing all of those biases, like the liking gap. They assumed those conversations were going to be pretty awkward. Even after the conversations, they had those doubts about how meaningful the connection was. But after, even 5 days, not even the whole week, those expectations had started to recalibrate and change. So they stopped fearing rejection so much. They didn't expect those conversations to be awkward. They actually just knew they were going to be pleasurable, that they would get that mood boost after connecting. So it's a very short amount of time, but I think it was just enough practice to reinforce the positive buzz that you get each time you do kind of act brave socially and try to connect with someone. It was positive reinforcement that built up over the week. And then, even when they stopped doing the actual experiment, these people continued to feel great while they were socializing for at least another week afterwards. So it lingered, the good feelings lingered.
Wow, that's impressive. Actually,
Yeah.
not bad. So, 5 days of work and you get a week plus of extra benefits.
Yeah, exactly. And then, I think if you say you just make it your aim to kind of continue that, maybe not every day talking to a completely new person, but just when you have the right opportunities to go and do that. You could just think, anytime I see someone struggling with their shopping in the supermarket, I'm going to offer to help. You make that habit, I think you're going to have a lifetime of changed opinions. You're going to feel a lot more connected to your community, a greater sense of belonging. And I think it's going to make those other opportunities for connection just so much easier. So if you're practicing this, on your like lunchtime walk, and then you have to kind of go to a networking event at work, walk into a room where you don't know anyone around at all, you're going to find that a lot less daunting because you've already built up this massive experience that shows you that actually this is going to be a really fun experience, not something that's going to lead to awkwardness and embarrassment.
Two things come to mind when you talk about that. One, to kind of your first summary point about, it seems like it's really about making it about other people. And so if we can ask them questions, point things out that we like about their hair, their appearance, their energy, their attitude, their dog, their whatever, we're immediately kind of putting it off of our shoulders and onto theirs. And correct me if I'm wrong, but most people enjoy talking about themselves, and it's very flattering. So I feel like, one, is that true? Is really kind of the secret sauce here, primarily, or first of all, making it more about the other person to take that stress and pressure off of us, but also to really keep them attentive. And two, the last part you just talked about, walking into a room and, kind of really beginning to talk to other people. Is it about the time as well? If we commit to decreasing the window of time from thinking about what we're going to talk about to just, the first person you lock eyes with, you introduce yourself, you say hi, does time have a contributing factor to our level of connection and feeling good as well?
Yeah, so I mean, I kind of agree with you on both counts. But yeah, first of all, I so actually self-disclosure, like talking about yourself, is really important when you're building depth in a relationship. And that can happen very quickly. Like even during the first conversation, you should be revealing as much about yourself as you're trying to get the other person to reveal about themselves. But I do think
you're, to give, right?
Yeah, exactly. But I feel like your opening gambit, if you're opening gambit with someone you don't know, is going to be like, hey, did you know that, like, I don't know, I had a great breakfast this morning. Like, it's not going to be a great way to start the conversation. Like, I agree with you totally that it is more flattering to notice something complimentary about the other person to trigger the conversation to start with, because it helps them to feel seen, to feel recognized. It's a great way to begin the conversation. And what the research shows us is that actually we go about our lives actually thinking loads of positive things about other people, and we just never say them because we're too scared that the compliment will seem clumsy, that the other person will kind of already know how great they are, and they're not going to want to hear it again.
Some of them might.
Right. Even if they do, I bet they'll love hearing it again from one more person. Yeah.
For all your narcissistic friends out there. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. You can never praise a narcissist too much, but even like the average person, they're going to be really flattered and pleased that you noticed them. So it's just such an easy way to connect that we neglect. Regarding your second question, I think one of the things that we do when we're feeling shy and introverted is that we do mentally rehearse stuff too much. And there's nothing wrong with just playing over, maybe reminding yourself of, if you have one person in mind, reminding yourself like what you want to say to them. But I think
get your lines down, play it cool a little bit, especially if it's a new or first impression, right?
Yeah, exactly. Nothing wrong with that. But like we should really do that kind of in moderation, because what shy people often do is they over rehearse, and so they're not, because they've kind of rehearsed this whole dialogue, then they're kind of thrown when the real conversation, which is spontaneous and flowing and fluid.
You're so focused on getting the lines right instead of just being present and attentive.
Yeah, because that's much more important, really, is to be, like you said, to be present, attentive, sensitive to the other person, to be able to riff on what the other person had said. So yeah, like I think, and that's where I think the timing comes into it. Like you said, just kind of without thinking too much about it, just go and approach that person and say something is better than you holding back and either kind of talking yourself out of it or rehearsing so much that the encounter is going to be more awkward.
What is the worst thing you think someone could do to improperly prepare for a conversation and interaction so that they, I'm going to rephrase that. What is the worst thing we can do in preparation for an interaction with another human being so that we actually lose the ability to be more attentive?
So I've noticed this with some of my acquaintances that it is kind of over rehearsal, but especially when they're like really thinking hard about stuff they want to show off about themselves. And that comes to dominate the conversation. And often, like, what happens then, like, if they, it doesn't matter what the other person's saying, they will kind of engineer the conversation in a way that will allow them to say what they want to say. And that can just seem super artificial. It's just not
Yeah.
flattering to the other
Yeah.
person. It can be very awkward because you start saying these kind of non sequiturs, like apropos nothing. I'm going to tell you about this new promotion or whatever. And I think that's a shame because actually, like, we worry about bragging, and it's fine for us to brag. Like, we underestimate how receptive people are to a little bit of bragging. Like, people tend to be really pleased for us if we've got something in our life that we're proud of that's made us happy. Um,
And the right
but like,
people should and will care about that, but it might just be a matter of, reading the room, having a little bit of candor and knowing who the person is you're sharing this information with, right?
yeah, that's exactly it. Just finding the right opportunity that should arise spontaneously rather than trying to engineer a whole situation, a whole conversation around that. Yeah, so it's like you said, like reading the room, just being sensitive to the other person, not trying to artificially create the kind of scenario where you can like, have this kind of mic drop moment. Like, it's never going to work out the way you want because what makes conversation and social interaction in general so exciting and pleasurable is the fact that it is this free flowing experience that can go off in like weird directions we hadn't expected. And so trying to get too much control over that is counterproductive.
Okay, this makes me think of like a same but different scenario. I've been in situations where I'm talking with someone that is a friend or I'm interested in further developing this relationship. I genuinely want to be more attentive. I want to show them that I care. But I'm struggling because of what you were just describing. I'm struggling because no matter what they ask me, no matter what I say, we still always kind of find our way back to them. We find our way back to them rerouting the conversation back to here's what I did, here's what I'm doing, here's my greatest accomplishment. What you said was cool, but I have something even cooler. Put yourself into my position or in the position of the person going through that. How can, if the goal is, and at least in this one scenario, to try to be as attentive as possible and try to really connect with this other human being despite kind of being met with them constantly rerouting back to them, what do we do then?
Yeah. I mean, so first of all, I think we shouldn't place all the responsibility for the conversation on ourselves. Like, if the other person isn't gonna kind of play fairly in this, that is their problem and their loss if they're going to lose the potential to connect with you. So, sometimes I think the art of conversation and of building connection in general is recognizing when it's not working out and maybe the other person has some kind of learning to do. They need to
Look,
make
it's
some
not me, it's
progress
you.
themselves. Yeah,
I've got to
exactly.
break up with this conversation.
Yes, I think sometimes it is like that, that even if you feel that in other circumstances, this person might actually be really interesting and someone you could really get on with. If they're not giving you what you need, you can only try so hard before you have to give up and maybe move on. And it doesn't have to be super awkward, and it doesn't mean you have to dismiss that person forever. Like you can try again another day, and maybe they'll be in a different mood.
But
Maybe
what about in that moment? Is
yeah.
there maybe like a go-to question or a go-to point that we could keep in our back pockets so that, all right, I've tried a couple times, they're not getting the hint, and I would like to give it one more shot. Is there a go-to question or statement that we can rely on to kind of help us go, all right, even after this, I've tried, they're not getting it. I know that I've given it all, and then now it's time for me to walk away. Any little tactic or go-to question?
Yeah. I mean, so there are definitely some kind of techniques you can try.
Lay it on
So
us.
yeah, like I feel like if you, so say the person is like bragging a lot about, which is often how this occurs, isn't it? When people are maybe they are too keen to show their successes. And even though you're pleased for them, you don't want to hear about that solely in the conversation.
Not the whole conversation,
Asking,
right?
right, exactly. Yeah. So I think then you could ask them uh, to talk a little bit more about their journey to this thing that they're boasting about. So, like what were the ups and downs? Like, especially what were the challenges that you faced? Like what, like just
So
say
shift
like,
away from the actual accomplishment and get to
yeah,
the beginning, the journey, like what got you there? How did you get
that
there?
that's what I think, because then they might become less focused on creating a good impression and they might be more emotionally vulnerable with you. Like, what disappointments did you face along the way? What were your fears? Like how did you get there? Because once they become more emotionally vulnerable, well, I mean, it's useful for you to kind of, if you want to connect with someone, it's good to kind of see behind this facade that they've created anyway. And they probably will be pleased to experience your empathy for that. But I also think that might
Yeah.
just prompt them to kind of look outside themselves and to try to connect better with you too, to try to ask you similar kinds of questions. So
Because
I
if we
think
can't
that's
connect to their
useful.
accomplishment or whatever they're bragging about, we more than likely can probably connect to an emotional situation they've been in to get them there, right?
Yeah, exactly. And so in another situation, it could just be that the person is kind of talking about something that you personally find super boring. Um, and so, then I sometimes think the fault could lie with us, actually. Like we can probe them a little bit more about why it's so important to them. Like, why do they think this is worth your time to talk about? Like, if it's an obscure hobby or like they're talking too much about their work routine. Well, like, what is it that you're trying to get at here? Like, often they'll be skirting over this surface, and they're not really saying like what they actually want to divulge. And so, just probing a bit deeper, kind of trying to see, what their emotional connection is to what they're talking about. I think that will help you to connect to them as well. Something I talk about in the book is this phenomenon called the novelty penalty, and it's that if we personally don't know much about a topic, we do tend to write it off as being boring, rather than digging deeper, showing our curiosity to really understand like why it's important to the other person. And so it's just a useful thing to know that if we think someone else is boring, like maybe we're actually at fault. Maybe we're the boring ones actually for not asking the right questions.
There's another section in the book that I think a lot of people can relate to in some capacity, and that's the burden of secrets. And you talk about how, quote, like most members of the LGBTQ plus community, I knew from a young age what it means to keep an important part of myself hidden from others. Talk to us about the burden of secrets, please, and what role does this play in our connection to others?
Yeah, so I mean, this is like as you said, it's like this personal experience that I had, but then it's backed up with a load of research that, when I was gay growing up, but I didn't come out, it's like it really felt very isolating because it's like you can't trust that other people like you for who you are, which creates a huge sense of distance. Like
And probably at
the
that point, you're still learning trust with yourself.
Right, exactly. It's complicated to navigate anyway. So, like there are other reasons for not coming out despite your fear of others' reactions. Like it can just be that you're not certain what your sexuality is yourself. But yeah, then it feels when you're going through that and you're not sharing it with people, and you don't trust that they will respond well to you, the whole friendship can feel quite superficial and meaningless because they like a version of you, but they don't actually like the real you. So that's partly why secrets can be so bad for our mental health is that they create this feeling of alienation that we have with the rest of the world potentially. But there are other ways that secrets can impair our mental health, and one is that we experience them almost like a physical burden. And so this comes from this idea of embodied cognition, which is that often our emotions manifest physically in the way the body is operating. And what the research shows is that when people are preoccupied by a secret, it actually leaves them feeling kind of physically heavier and weighed down. And you can test that in various ways, but it's like in the laboratory, you can ask like these participants, you've prompted them, primed them to think of a secret that they haven't told anyone about. And then you can ask them to like move a pile of books from one side of the room
You
to the
talked about
other.
this, yeah, the study with those who had cheated on their partners, and
Right.
this
Yeah,
this was
exactly.
the study they did, yeah.
Yeah. And then the people who were holding the secret, they actually picked up fewer books to carry because they already felt like they were carrying this heavier burden already.
So
They didn't feel
being more
strong
aware
enough.
of the secret
Yeah.
physically left them feeling weaker.
Yeah, exactly. So, and you can ask people when they've been primed to think about that secret, so it's kind of occupying their mind. You can ask them to estimate how steep a hill is going to be, and what you find is that they estimate the incline to be a lot greater than it really is. And we know that that also happens when you like get people to carry like a heavy rucksack, that they overestimate how steep an incline is going to be. Again, because they if you're carrying the physical burden, then you know you're going to have to put in a lot more work into climbing that hill. And the same thing happens if there's no real physical burden, but just the metaphorical burden of a secret. It makes people feel that they're
Mm.
encumbered, and that makes them overestimate the difficulties of physical challenges.
That's such an astounding point that I want to kind of just pause on for the audience. This is why I love talking about so many different things on this show, because it can shine a light into an area that we might be struggling with, or an area that for whatever reason we can't progress in, we can't optimize, despite doing all the things that we think we're supposed to do for that thing. And I'm
Yeah.
just thinking about maybe situations I've been in, or putting myself into the shoes of the audience member and going, why is it so difficult for me to open up to new people, or open up in my friend circle, my colleagues, my intimate partner? I'm doing all these other things, but the thing might be what you are not acknowledging. I'm not saying everybody has a deep, dark, crazy secret, but it could just be something that you're not being fully truthful with to yourself first and foremost. So that is going to be kind of your ceiling to how open and honest you can be with other people. So just really think about that, listener, viewer. If there's a limiting factor you're coming up against in your connection to others, is there something that you're not even aware of, or not opening up with yourself first? What secret maybe are you guarding consciously, subconsciously, that could be your limiting factor?
Yeah, I think that's a really powerful point. And like you say, I mean, as humans, we just have this amazing ability to hide away from the things we don't want to
Stuff
think
it down.
about.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So like you say, you might not be aware of this secret, or you might just be vaguely aware of it. It's like it's constantly in the periphery of your vision, but
Mm.
you're never looking directly at it. And if you don't look directly at it, you can't really deal with that effectively, acknowledge it, process how you're going to talk about this big thing to other people.
Could you maybe, I don't recall this being in the book, so, we might be going rogue here, but could you maybe walk us through how would you go about this, or how would you advise somebody to workshop with themselves, to go, okay, a lot of this stuff you're talking about thus far makes sense. I've been trying to put myself out there, be more honest, be more engaging, be more attentive. But walk us through a process maybe of maybe self-reflection. Is it certain questions? Put us in the scenario of, how can I even ask myself the question of, what secret am I keeping that is preventing me from opening up and connecting more with others? How can we really even navigate that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's tough if we're not really, if we've built up this habit of avoiding the topics that we don't want to, that we just want to neglect. And I think some people, have built that, it's more ingrained in their lives than for other people. But, like a lot of these social skills and psychological strategies in general, I think it does come with practice. And it might just be in moments of introspection, just noticing when your mind um, skirts around a subject without fully acknowledging that. And it might not be the biggest secret, it might be something else, but notice when um,
Right. It doesn't
you're
have to
kind of
be,
fleeing.
I've been,
Yeah,
cheating on my partner for 10 years or, I hit a body in the backyard kind of thing. It doesn't have to be this deep, dark secret,
right.
but it could just be something, to your point, you're skirting around. Why?
Right, yeah, exactly. Yeah, so ask yourself, like, why am I doing that? Try to redirect your thinking back to what it is you're trying to avoid. And, you might start out by doing that with a pretty small secret, something that's not, fundamental, like you said, your identity. But then as you go through that process of almost like disentangling your thoughts, you might find that it's actually easier then to probe the bigger questions, the bigger things that you're hiding from yourself. And I guess this is something that people go through in therapy and psychotherapy, that a trained therapist is helping you to do that. But you can do it yourself. And one strategy that I practice myself that's very useful, it's almost like a very cheap and effective form of personal therapy, is expressive writing, which is
What is
exactly
that?
that. Yeah, I mean, it's kind of exactly as it sounds, but we have to be a bit careful about how we practice it. And so it's just spending maybe 15 minutes a day, a few times a week, maybe even less than that, maybe just once a week, just writing about our deepest, innermost thoughts. And it can start out as venting, but ultimately we want to move a bit beyond um, just expressing kind of rage or sadness or anxiety. We also want to look at the kind of overall narrative behind that. So again, trying to work out, what the causes were, like where it originates, to recognize how you're processing that. So what kind of thoughts do those feelings then trigger? Is it a chain reaction of thoughts that's going on, or are you just hiding completely? And it's normally something you would avoid thinking about at all, but just analyzing that essentially in this 15 minutes of writing. You don't want to do more because it becomes too much of a burden if you decide to spend an hour or, a whole day doing your expressive writing. Like, you don't have to have any ambitions to write a memoir or a novel about your experiences. But the research shows it really does help. Like, with practice, people become much better at engaging in constructive reflection. So they're not just venting; they're actually reappraising what they're feeling. They're finding those underlying patterns, and then that comes with a whole bunch of benefits, psychological and physical. So actually, people who've engaged in expressive writing tend to need to visit the doctors less, like they're less susceptible to physical health complaints, because it seems that by relieving this psychological burden, it also just releases a lot of stress from our day-to-day lives once you've put some of those thoughts to bed, and then that has a physical benefit for your body, for your immune system. So it's a good thing to do. And then I feel like if you've done that processing yourself privately, after a while, you're going to find it easier to talk about those things with other people as well. You're going to have deeper insights that you feel readier to share with other people, rather than when you maybe have those raw emotions that you try to hide away from rather than express.
Do you think there is a point of, we'll say, diminishing return in our level of expressiveness, openness? Let's say we workshop, we go through that and we learn how to be very expressive and open and honest with ourselves. And then we love it so much. And then we then carry that over into our conversations with familiars or even strangers. Is there a point of diminishing return when we actually should kind of throttle back that openness and expressiveness so that we can preserve that connection even more?
Yeah, I mean, in theory, there shouldn't be, because people do really warm to people who are more open. And the more authentic, the more honest you can be, the more people do seem to warm to you. And that's been shown in lots of different experiments. That I feel very confident in saying that the more open you can be, the better. But again, this is a guideline, not a hard and fast rule. It's not like an algorithm that you can just kind of apply in every
It's not
situation.
always if then in these situations, right?
Right, exactly. Because you have to be sensitive to the other person. And be aware of the fact that they are going through their own emotional stuff. They're carrying their own baggage. They don't always want to hear every little psychodrama that you've been processing with your expressive
Yeah,
writing.
true. Yeah.
So, picking a good time, um, and making sure that you reciprocate. So making sure that if you are open with other people, that you do give them the opportunity to be open with you, to ask the right questions, and to be there to listen to them when they do want it. And sometimes you might find that the conversation leaves very little time for you to talk about yourself, and that is fine too. You just want, on average, for you both to be sharing the conversation about 50-50. But it doesn't have to be that every single conversation has to have this kind of split down the middle. That would be totally unnatural.
The book, you go through these 12 laws of connection and then even get into, in your conclusion, the 13th law of connection. And I find all of them, really, some more than others to me personally, extremely valuable now, especially in this post-pandemic world. I'm curious, had the world not gone through what we all just went through with this global pandemic, would you still have written the book? Do you feel like now connection is only more important, or has this always been of utmost importance and so it's always timely?
Yeah, I mean, I think it is always timely. People were writing a lot about the loneliness epidemic way before we had the COVID pandemic. So I think that, first of all, I think like there's been a lot of hand-wringing over loneliness over the last decade. But actually, if you look back in the historical record, people have been feeling lonely for pretty much the whole of humanity's history. I think we often tend to look back at the past with these rose-tinted nostalgic spectacles where we imagine that we're the only generation who faced something like loneliness. But actually, we spoke earlier about in historic societies, if you grew up in the same village, you might have been less likely to experience something like the liking gap because you were familiar with more people who were around you. But that comes with some disadvantages too, because, if you have a really limited number of people to connect with, it could be that you don't feel a strong connection with any of them because they don't share the particular niche interests as you, or you might be a member of the LGBT community and there's no one else who's really going to understand that side of your personality. Whereas now, actually, in the modern world, we have a lot more possibility to connect with people who do share the same experiences as us. So yeah, I do think loneliness has been around forever. I feel like the pandemic really just focused our attention on that. It showed us so starkly what it was like to not have the physical presence of other people around us, and it made us realize how much we missed that. But the importance of social connection is going to be with humanity for as long as there are humans walking the earth.
I know we're getting close to our time here. Do you have a couple more minutes?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, however long you need.
I have one more question before my final. Thank you. The one that really stood out the most to me was number 12, and that's finding forgiveness. And I think forgiveness, like we talked about, for ourselves, but also for others, as open and honest as we can be and attentive to our own experiences, thoughts, emotions is going to help the relationship with ourselves. But then we can carry that over into connections and attentiveness with others and enhance those relationships. But for many people, forgiveness is going to be a huge limiting factor. Forgiveness to ourselves, forgiveness to someone else, to open up possibility for connection or to rekindle connection. Talk to us about forgiveness and why is this so important in our ability to connect to others?
Yeah, I mean, I'm so glad you asked about forgiveness because no one has asked me
Really?
about that yet. Yeah.
Oh, it's
And yeah,
huge. It's huge.
yeah, exactly. That's what I think it's one of the most important lessons from the book. So we know that forgiveness is really tightly connected to health, like all kinds of social connection are connected to health, but forgiveness in particular, like people who report holding a lot of grudges, more likely to suffer from an early death from things like heart disease than people who don't hold grudges. So releasing your anger and resentment of someone else can be incredibly cathartic. And And it's like it's almost like we were talking about the physical burden of secrets. Well, I really think that holding resentment for other people is just another kind of physical burden that it is like a poison that can eat us up inside.
Yeah, what's the phrase? Resentment is drinking poison and hoping that it works on the other person or something like that, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's exactly it. And so if we can find forgiveness within ourselves, it's one of the best things we can do to improve our mental and our physical well-being. But it's easier said than done. Now, the research by the kind of world-leading expert in forgiveness, I think he's called Everett Worthington, and he basically shows that it can help just to recognize that forgiveness can be an active, conscious decision. So even if you are feeling that resentment, you can still decide that you will forgive the other person in the same way that you might decide to perform any altruistic act, that it's in your own power. You can feel empowered to think, like, from this day forward, I am going to try to resent them. I'm going to try to stop letting them occupy such a central place in my mind. If I have the opportunity, I will treat them with compassion rather than spite. And that does seem to work. He's created these free online worksheets that people can go through. And, when people do complete those exercises, what you find is that their levels of forgiveness increase and their health improves as a result. Like they're
So
less
true
likely.
forgiveness is really a series of choices of letting go. It's not so much
Yeah.
just I decided, therefore I've forgiven them. It has to have this compounding effect.
Yeah, that's how I see it. It's something that we can work at every day. Like every time we find ourselves consumed with like anger for that other person, we can try to let it go. In the same way that when you practice mindfulness, you can acknowledge what you're feeling or what you're
Mm.
thinking, but you can also try to let that go. You don't have to hold on to that thought. You can just see it as almost like a weather system that is passing you by, rather than getting really
Right.
involved mentally in what's going on and kind of shouting at those clouds that are gonna be there whether you pay attention to them or not. So
Yeah,
yeah,
sometimes just stating the problem, stating the pain is as
yeah,
much work as working through it.
yeah,
We struggle even to just acknowledge that resentment, that pain is there because
yeah,
for a lot of different reasons we've shoved it down. We don't want to bring it up. It's too painful. So I'm hearing you say it really starts with acknowledgement and
yeah.
then forgiveness are the steps afterwards.
Yeah, exactly. And literally stating to yourself, like, I choose to forgive this person. And then there are other exercises you can do a bit similar to expressive writing, but
Mm.
write out a letter that you never have to send to the other person, but extending your forgiveness to them and showing the compassion, recognizing also times when you yourself have acted in a way that has hurt other people. So recognizing that actually, we're all, none of us are perfect, and kind of doing wrong for others is a universal experience, which
Mm.
recognizing that fact can help to increase your compassion. If you recognize that we all have circumstances sometimes that are beyond our control that can lead us to behaviors that we feel ashamed of afterwards, and if we hope to be forgiven ourselves, we can try to extend that to the other person. So it's that kind of act, and it does seem to be very effective. So that's one thing we can do. I think what also affects us is not when we have these lingering resentments with someone, that can last years or a lifetime, but also just in everyday arguments. It might be with our like partner, with a friend, with a colleague. Um, the problem is that when we feel that we've been hurt, when there's this kind of injustice, our mental perspective becomes too finely focused, and we're really looking at these tiny details that come to
Mm.
seem kind of epic, like they're like mountainous on the mental landscape.
And they're
And
not.
yeah, no, exactly. Like we know that with time, those things often take their proper perspective, but we can accelerate that process by using a couple of psychological techniques that are, it's called psychological distancing. And the the aim is just to try to engineer the perspective that you might get with time. So one simple way is to just try to imagine that you're looking back on this event in 6 months or a year's time or 10 years' time. How do you think you're going to view the event as a whole and all of those individual details? And what you're more likely to recognize, is that actually those things that seem really important today will be so tiny you'll probably forget about them.
Yeah.
They're just not worth you stressing yourself out or wrecking a relationship over stuff that is, like, in the grand scheme of things, so trivial.
Or even just gaining some kind of relational point, thinking to maybe another time when
Yeah.
someone has wronged you or you've been in a similar situation, and look at where you are now. Time does go on. Time and space does provide a level of healing. So in that moment, sure, it's very difficult. We think, how am I ever going to get to that point? How am I ever going to be able to forgive them? But odds are you have before. And so
Right.
kind of just try to tie into that experience more, right?
Right, exactly. And so, again, it's just kind of that's helping you to let that storm pass overhead without becoming too involved in that mentally and emotionally. There's a study that looked at a group of newlyweds, and essentially they kind of just left these newlyweds to continue as they would have done normally for a year. And what you found is that their relationship satisfaction, sadly, kind of did decline quite a bit over that first year. But then at that midpoint of the study, they taught these couples the psychological distancing technique. They just said, when you have your next argument, just practice this. Just make sure that you try to take a step backwards, consider the event from this extended perspective of looking at it, from a year's time, or imagine that an objective observer is viewing this squabble, and what would they think of it?
That one's huge. Yeah, I've been there. That one helps a lot.
Absolutely. And that's exactly what they found, was that actually, for the couples who learned that technique, their relationships satisfaction stabilized. It was so much better than the other groups who didn't learn that technique, and they continued on that downward trajectory. So it can be very beneficial. It might just save your marriage if you're having difficulties.
I wanted to bring up forgiveness because, especially at the end, I feel like in my personal life, I have not been able to truly move forward in my life, and certainly in my connections and relationships with myself and with others, in the way that I want to, without attachment and without grudges and without holding on to things, without forgiveness. And so, I feel like we can't truly live a life ever forward. We cannot continue to move forward if we do not practice, at least, and hopefully get to a point of embodying certain types and levels of forgiveness. So with that, David, I want to ask you, ever forward, those two words, what do they mean to you? How do you live a life ever forward?
So I feel like for me, the most important principle really is curiosity. It just drives everything I do. And it's so important for my work to constantly be learning new stuff. It's really important for what I do in my private life. Even that motivates stuff like my own physical workouts, is kind of testing, like, what can my body do? How am I going to feel if I, choose this scenario over that scenario? Curiosity is just such a powerful motivation. It's what psychologists call an implicit motivator. Like, it just comes from within, and it's one of those finding that motivation where you're pursuing something for your own personal interest and pleasure without any pressure from outside. That's the best kind of motivation you can have, and that's why I think it's really so important for me personally.
Well, it's been a pleasure talking with you. Thank you so much for your extra time here today. If you guys want to learn more about David, I'm going to have all of his information down in the description box in the show notes. You can check out The Laws of Connection wherever you get books. I will have it linked for you, like I said, down below. But David, where can they go if they want to connect with you directly, or where are you hanging out the most online these days?
I do love hearing from readers and listeners. So I'm on X, D_A_Robson, Instagram, David A. Robson. I'm just starting out building up my following there. And my website is davidarobson.me.
Too easy. Well, David, thank you so much. And yeah, ever forward. We'll wrap it there.
Thank you. Yeah, it's a pleasure.
Okay. Yeah. So like I said, before I end the recording, if I could just get a quick intro clip, please. So name, title, whatever you want to say about yourself briefly, 5-10 seconds kind of thing. And then welcome to Ever Forward Radio, or this is Ever Forward Radio, something like that.
Yep.
Okay.
Sure.
I'll give you a thumbs up. I'm going to mute my end and then just look right in the camera and fire away.
Hi, I'm David Robson, a science writer and author of The Laws of Connection. Welcome to Ever Forward Radio.